Ivy League schism or much ado about nothing? That is the topic of today's video. My name is Craig Meister. I'm a college admissions coach. You can learn more about me and how you can work with me one-on-one throughout the entire college admissions process on my website, which is collegemeister.com. And if you're interested in learning about whether or not you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America, go over to my new free 3-minute online assessment at areyouontracktogetin.com. Again, that's areyouontracktogetin.com. After you complete that 3-minute assessment, your results will be emailed to you right away, and they will help you clarify whether or not you are or your student is on track for selective college admission in the United States of America. So in recent months, I've gotten many emails from parents and students all around the world trying to decipher the meaning and the truth behind why 4 Ivy League schools have decided to go back to being test required for the 24-25 admission cycle. One additional Ivy League school has announced it will go back to being test required for the 25-26 admission cycle. And 3 Ivy League schools are, as of right now, remaining test optional for the 24-25 admission cycle and have made no announcements about what happens beyond that point, though Columbia is somewhat indicating very staunchly that it plans to remain test optional for the foreseeable future. What is the meaning behind this is the gist of the emails that I have received over recent weeks and months. And a lot of individuals in their emails say more things like, they think that maybe there's a schism or an ideological bifurcation between these 2 basic groups of Ivy League schools, which you can also sort of map out geographically as being sort of the mid-Atlantic Ivies, Penn, Princeton, and Columbia, which are remaining test optional for the time being. And then the New England Ivies, which are Brown, Dartmouth, Yale, and Harvard, which have gone back to being test required for the 24-25 admission cycle. And then there's Cornell, which is remaining test optional for 24-25, but and is in between sort of geographically, but has announced that it will be going back to being test required for 25 and 26. So there's a lot of rumor going around. There's a lot of talk about what does this mean? Does this mean that the New England Ivy League schools, for instance, are more conservative and the Mid-Atlantic Ivy League schools are more liberal? Does this mean that the New England Ivy League schools believe they were getting subpar students through test optional, and this means that the other Ivy League schools, the Mid-Atlantic, feel like they are very happy with the type of students they're getting? So there's a lot of sort of confusion or consternation about the meaning behind this and maybe what it maybe portends about the direction of these schools. And what I'm here to share with you today is that I don't think it's that cut and dry. And I actually would argue that a lot of the conjecture that I just shared is absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. You have to put everything into context. The fact of the matter is a lot of other things have been going on these Ivy League campuses over the last year too, including 3 presidential departures, at least, 2 under sort of scandal, if you will, 1 somewhat under scandal. But the point is, or at least unpopularity. So a lot of other things are going on these campuses, including massive leadership change, but also there have been protests and questions about how the schools are dealing with protests and dealing with studentism. A lot of other things are swirling around beyond just test optional. I make the argument that much of what has gone on that has caused controversy at all the Ivy League schools over the last year to 4 years can actually be traced back to going test optional. That is my personal opinion. But the reasons why colleges have gone back to being test required is interesting. It is not so cut and dry as, these 4 decided test optional was bad for their campuses. In fact, they're saying nothing of the sort. The New England Ivy League schools, sort of like the Eastern Roman Empire, if you will, and the Mid-Atlantic Ivy League schools, sort of the Western Roman Empire, if you will. These are schools that basically all think alike and act alike. And so it is interesting anytime the schools start acting differently, the question marks start to be raised, right? But what's basically, I think, happened is this. All the colleges, these Ivies, but of course colleges beyond the Ivies, but they take their cues from the Ivies in many cases, the schools beyond the Ivies, but all the Ivies went test optional in 2020 at a time that intersected with the start of the COVID shutdowns and lockdowns, and also at a time in which the United States was going under real social tumult with violence and protests. Ideologically, neither of those things were the real reason the colleges went test optional. The real reason the colleges went test optional is because they wanted to do everything they possibly could not to have a paper trail of how they were practicing affirmative action. And they already knew Harvard was sort of in the dock for going to the Supreme Court for basically overtly practicing discrimination against certain students in favor of other students that, objectively speaking, were very non-comparable as cohorts. And so the pandemic, coinciding a couple months later with, of course, the racial reckoning in the United States that was occurring socially at the time and politically at the time, were easy to piggyback on to as reasons why the colleges wanted to take a break from testing. And then, of course, in the months since, of course, the years since, the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action was illegal, basically, in the United States, in admissions purposes. The way in which affirmative action was being practiced at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and also Harvard was illegal and unconstitutional. And Harvard really never made any apologies for that. Now, you should note that. They never made any apologies for it because ultimately the individuals at Harvard ideologically believe that the end justifies the means, and the means that they were trying to pursue at Harvard, as all the other Ivy League schools, is to create the demographic breakdown in the student population that the individual powers that be at these colleges want. So that is the guiding light that you have to understand. The Ivy League schools are under the same ownership, if you will, the same leadership, the same ideological framework that they've been all along in this whole story, if you will, going back to the late 2000 teens. Like you could argue basically since 2016 and onward, minimum, these colleges and universities basically all march to the beat of the same drummer. And so that's why it's somewhat concerning in the eyes of just a layperson. Or it's confusing at the very least, not necessarily concerning. Why did some Ivies go back to being test required and some remain test optional? And it is not an Ivy League schism. I think it is much ado about nothing. What basically has happened is the Mid-Atlantic Ivies are not so confident yet that the way in which not so confident yet in their current means by which they want to socially engineer the college classes, entering classes that they want. So they want to have as many tools at their disposal, including test optional, in order to finagle or compose the type of entering classes that they want demographically. And this cuts in every which way. I mean, this cuts in terms of sex, gender, in terms of socioeconomic background, international versus domestic, sexual preference. I mean, every which way, colors, weights, religions, everything that they can have at their disposal in order to compose the class that they want. They want to be able to have the full toolkit, as they say. And test optional is a tool in their toolkit, in their toolkit at Princeton, Penn, and Columbia that they want to have available to them moving forward. Harvard, Dartmouth, Brown, and Yale ideologically want this as much diversity that they want as well. They don't want any less diversity than a few months ago. They just believe they have found enough tools to work with that they no longer need test optional. They feel like that is something they're willing to give on and also get the PR to boot for getting rid of test optional. And they feel like they can now practice admissions in such a way where they can legally continue to compose the types of the classes that they want without the tool that is test optional. Which is interesting because they clearly didn't feel that way in 2017, 2018, 2019, before they went test optional. Because ultimately they went test optional. So why did they really go test optional? They went test optional, like I said, because at the time it wasn't so socially normed, or I don't think that's the right way of putting it. It wasn't socially approved in polite circles yet to practice what holistic admissions has become, which is overt equitable admissions. The word equitable, when used as sort of the phantom word behind holistic, is a little bit more structured than holistic. Holistic makes it sound like, as I've said in previous videos, that we're going to consider everything, your context, your environment, your scores, your grades, your essays, your letters of recommendation, your extracurriculars, and then we're going to make the right decision for us and the right decision for you. What holistic admissions has turned into in the intervening years from, let's say, 2019 up until 2024 is holistic admissions really is now code for equitable admissions. And because equity has become so commonplace and normalized in American society over the past 5 years in particular, the thinking goes on the campuses of Yale, Harvard, Dartmouth, and Brown. And they basically said as much in their decision announcements when they went back to test required, that they're not going back to the same regime as before. They're going back to a regime where they require your test scores, but they promise to review your test scores in context. And that gives them all the carte blanche they need to continue to assemble or socially engineer the classes that they ultimately want. The other thing you have to understand is that ideologically, the populations of the leadership of these colleges, whether it be the president's office, the provost's office, or the admissions office, is basically homogeneous at this point. Other things that have happened in recent weeks and months has been, for instance, MIT announcing that they're doing away with diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. And there's been a big hubbubaloo in the media, particularly conservative media, saying this is a sign that, quote unquote, we're winning, meaning the conservatives are winning, that these loyalty oaths or these diversity statements were a bridge too far, even for very liberal institutions like MIT. But that, again, is also misunderstanding the situation. These institutions, MIT included, which went test required a couple of years back, they had the shortest duration of test optional of almost any school out there. The leadership of these schools, even if their presidents change, their provosts change, their admissions deans change, are basically now homogeneous one-party states. I mean, they really are, and they're highly left of center. They're highly progressive organizations. Nothing has changed and nothing will change in the foreseeable future, whether or not Claudine Gay is in charge of Harvard or someone else is in charge of Harvard. All right, this is true of all the institutions. Ideologically, nothing has changed at any of these institutions. So you may be saying, well, why did 4 go back to being test required and 3 didn't and 1 is going to go back? It's because, like I said, the Southern or the Mid-Atlantic Ivies still aren't confident enough yet that they can get away with the type of admissions practices that Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, and Brown feel are normalized enough, particularly in New England society, where they are based. Whereas the ones in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, they're a little bit more leery, or they're not yet confident enough to take the leap to start practicing equitable admissions so blatantly, so obviously, like the ones in New England now are ready to practice. Equitable admissions is basically a situation in which you treat different candidates to different standards. You hold different applicants to different standards, not based off race officially, but maybe based off zip code, or maybe based off state, or maybe based off school. Oftentimes it comes down to the school and the profile of the school and the demographics of the school. All 8 Ivy League institutions are in lockstep ideologically, just like today they are. They were last month, last year, and last decade. These are not institutions that really are straying off the company line. Now, there are some public schools, UNC included, which also lost at the Supreme Court with Harvard, that because the Board of Trustees has changed over and the Board of Trustees is more moderate, and because they also have to answer to voters as being a state institution, that is a school that really could theoretically become a moderate institution ideologically. And it's already happening in other ways. related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and the pullback there. And that's, of course, happening in other states, particularly conservative states in the United States of America. Those institutions, there is a real pendulum swing back from sort of more left of center to more moderate institutions. But the Ivies the boards have not changed at the Ivies. And therefore, even if the placeholder presidents have changed in recent months at some, ideologically, all the same people there today were there basically 6 months ago, 3 years ago, 6 years ago. So as a result, there's no real schism in the Ivy League at all. And again, I want to make very, very clear what equitable admissions is for anyone who did not catch it the first couple times I said it in this video and then in other videos I've stated it in. Equitable admissions is where different candidates, because of their demographics, not necessarily race, but because of other demographic things about them, where they went to school, the state they're from, the country they're from, are held to completely different standards. And the reason also, of course, they can do it is because ideologically, the admissions offices don't have much ideological, if any, ideological diversity. So it's actually easier to practice equitable admissions in an environment where everyone thinks and acts alike and basically has the same end goals in mind. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. So again, if anything, the Ivy League institutions are more ideologically dogmatic than they've been ever before. There's been no moderating influences and certainly no conservative influences in any way penetrating the decision centers within the Ivy League. The Ivy League institutions are highly liberal, highly progressive, highly left of center institutions. Some throw out the word woke to describe the Ivies. That would be a word that I think could definitely apply to all the Ivies. And so even though only 5 are going officially back to being test required and 3 remain test optional, and that looks like a schism on the surface, there is no schism. It's just a matter of what tools these colleges want to have at their disposal to get away with what they want to ultimately get away with. It does interestingly show, though, that the Ivies in New England are quite confident that they have what it takes to do what they want to do. And so, if anything, I think it does show just a personality difference between the New England Ivies as opposed to the Mid-Atlantic Ivies. And of course, Cornell is sort of in between, which is, when you're in a more ideologically homogeneous, not just organization, but overall region, you take a little more risk and you are at the edge, so the tip of the spear, as opposed to the Mid-Atlantic Ivies that there's a little bit more ideological diversity within reach of those campuses. My name is Craig Meister. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and also consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to work with me one-on-one throughout the entire college admissions process, go to my website, collegemeister.com. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, and most importantly, stay stress-free throughout the entire college admissions process.